So for someone to title a video, why you should play this, or why you should watch that, or whatever, they have to be under the impression that whatever they're talking about deserves more attention than it's already received. But see, this video is about the mega popular cultural landmark Final Fantasy VII, a game that anybody who knows anything about video games has heard of. It's pretty easy to argue that a case doesn't need to be made for this game anymore. I mean, it's over 20 years old, so it's had plenty of time to reach as many people as it possibly can, right? Well, here's the thing. Not only is it really old, but it was a PlayStation exclusive at the time of its release. So there are a lot of people who just never got the chance to play it, either because it came out before their time or because they didn't own a PlayStation. Fortunately, the game's received a lot of ports since it first came out. If you want to play it, you probably have something that can. It's on Steam, Xbox, PS3, PS4, the Switch, and even if you don't have any of these things, then you can just get it on your phone. So accessibility isn't a problem anymore, but there is another issue, and if you've played Final Fantasy VII and tried to recommend it to anybody before, then you've probably dealt with this. At their 2015 E3 conference, Sony announced a remake of the game, and man, the trailers and screenshots for it have not been nice to the original game. Like, they look really, really good, and the PS1 version just doesn't. So now, whenever you recommend Final Fantasy VII to anybody, it doesn't matter who they are, chances are they're probably going to say, nah man, I'm just gonna wait for the remake. And you know what, to be fair, I was guilty of this too. I bought the game in 2015, first on Steam and then on the PS4, and it took me 3 years to finally sit down and commit to playing it all the way through. I don't know exactly why I had this attitude. I know the remake had something to do with it. The knowledge that it was coming probably made me less tolerant of the fact that even though the game was fun, everybody was made out of triangles and squares, and I had to read everything that everybody was saying. I mean, I know that that sounds petty and stupid, but the point is, I get that people have their own personal reasons for maybe not wanting to check this game out. It's in a really awkward position right now because it's more accessible than it ever has been before, but if it's in your backlog and you haven't played it yet, it's really easy to say to yourself, well, I don't need to spend my money and time on the game now when I could just wait for the remake. And since I know that this is a fairly common perspective, like I said, it's one that I had not too long ago, let's move on to my first major point. So the first and most important reason is that this remake isn't going to be a substitute for the original game. For example, let's take a look at another remake, the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy. While there are a couple gameplay and engine differences present between the two versions of these three games, generally speaking, the compilation's pretty faithful to the original Crash trilogy. If you were to play through the N. Sane Trilogy, then graphics aside, you'd be getting the same experience as somebody playing the Crash games on their PS1. The same can't be said for Final Fantasy VII and its remake, though. No matter what, you are just not going to be able to talk to somebody who's only played the PS1 version of Final Fantasy VII about the game if you have only played the remake. While I'm not confident saying that the two versions of the game are going to be completely different, I'm also not confident that they'll be similar enough to even be considered the same game. A good example of this sort of thing is Metal Gear Solid 1 and its remake on the GameCube, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. While the plot, set pieces, and level design are shared between both games, the way they play is pretty different from one another. Now, both are great games, but they are still different games, and one is only a substitute for the other as far as plot is concerned. Now, the Final Fantasy VII remake seems like it's going to be even more different than the game it's based on than the Twin Snakes was. Like, for example, the Twin Snakes wasn't split into 3 separate games. This is the biggest problem with the remake, in my opinion. You're gonna have to pay nearly $200 for the complete package, and you're also gonna have to wait like 4 to 6 years to see the end of the game. And the worst part is, the first of these 3 games, at least according to the information we have on hand right now, is only going to let you explore Midgar. That is the first area of the game that you can explore before you even have access to the world map, and in the original game it takes you about like 3 to 5 hours to get through it. Now, to be fair, Square is supposedly adding a bunch of side content to make playing through Midgar like a 30-hour experience as opposed to a 3 to 5 hour one, but that just proves the point I was making earlier. At this point, it's not the same game anymore. I mean, I'm sure it'll be fun. I'm gonna buy all 3 games in the remake series unless the first one sucks. But the point is, I'm not telling anybody not to buy or play the remake. If you want to, go for it. I don't care. Like I said, I'm gonna do it. But what I am saying is, don't look at this game like it's just gonna be a prettier version of this game. They are 2 completely different games, and if you're interested in one, that does not mean you should completely ignore the other. Now, let's push all those remake comparisons out the window. Let's just get rid of them and look at Final Fantasy VII as a standalone product. The only way I could even begin to think that you could maybe criticize how this game begins is by pointing out how long the opening cutscene is. It's like 2 minutes, which is kind of a lot, but as soon as it ends, things begin happening immediately. Like, here, let's go ahead and start a stopwatch as soon as control is given to the player. In less than 12 seconds, you've already been given the option to cut one of these two poor souls in half. And if we want to be even more generous to this game, we can say things get exciting as early as 5 seconds into the game when you encounter your first enemy. Yeah, you have to wait for the encounter animation to finish, but I feel like the in the background do enough to get the player excited that it's not egregious for the game to ask them to wait like 5 seconds for the attack prompt to pop up. Like, I doubt anybody's gonna see this and just be like, ah, no, that's it. That's the last straw of Final Fantasy VII. The game's taking too long. Guess I gotta turn it off. But even if that is the case for you, all the modern ports of the game come with a built-in speed-up function that turns this 5 to 6 second wait into more of a, like, 1.5 to 2 second wait. So the game doesn't take very long to get started at all. It puts enemies in front of you pretty much right away. And speaking of that, let's take a moment to analyze this first fight here, so I can tell you why it's fucking brilliant. So not only does this game thrust you into the action pretty much right away, it also does a pretty effective job of telling you how it works. Like, just look at these options right here, and I dare you to tell me that you are confused. You only have 3 different things to pick from: attack, magic, and item, and all of them are self-explanatory. Even if you are the dumbest person to have ever held a controller, the game gives you plenty of time to experiment with these 3 options by making sure that the soldiers you're fighting don't damage you all that much. And what's great about this, while we're on the subject of taking damage from these two fellas, is that while the game does let you know that you have plenty of time to figure out how everything works now in your first battle, it also lets you know, by having one of the soldiers attack you before you have the opportunity to select any of these 3 options, that you can be attacked while navigating the menus in this game, and so in the future, against more powerful enemies, you won't have an unlimited amount of time to make your decisions. Now, back on the subject of the menus, the only option out of the 3 that you were initially presented with a function that might not be immediately apparent, is magic. But as soon as you cast one of your 2 spells, you should learn right away what makes doing this different from using a regular attack. The game tells you that you need to expend a resource called MP to use one of these things, and even if you miss that, you get to see your MP gauge go down as soon as the spell is cast. The game even waits for the animation to be completed before it does this, just in case you were too busy watching this guy get electrocuted to death to pay attention to any of the menus at the bottom. Now, as soon as you kill one of the 2 soldiers, you'll find out that you can't attack again immediately, and unless you are actively trying not to look at it, your attention will probably eventually come to this time meter on the bottom right here. For a little bit, its purpose might seem unclear, but before long, it'll ding and you'll have the option to attack again. And this should, of course, tell you that you can't perform any actions until this gauge is full. Now, you learn all of this in this one fight. There's no tutorial beforehand. There aren't even any tutorial prompts in the fight. You just figure everything out by playing the game. Now, making a game this intuitive that teaches you this much in a single 30-second fight, like, I mean, no matter how you want to spin it, that's just really good fucking game design. An issue I have with a lot of other games is that getting through their opening sections can be pretty rough sometimes. To use another Final Fantasy game as an example, Final Fantasy 15 kind of demands a lot from the player. You have to play through this really lengthy tutorial section at the beginning, which is optional, but you should play through it if you want to be even a little bit competent at the game. And, I mean, like a lot of tutorials, I found it super boring, but meanwhile, in Final Fantasy VII, you don't really feel like you're being instructed on how to play the game, but you're learning everything about it that you need to anyway. Moving on from just the first fight, throughout the rest of the first set piece, you learn about random encounters, gaining experience and money, save points, limit breaks, loot drops, you find your first materia, you fight your first boss fight, you get a bunch of insight into the world and characters, and this all happens in just 17 minutes! Yeah, so the game has pretty good pacing, especially for an RPG. If we compare it to another popular turn-based RPG, and also one of my favorite games of all time, Pokemon Red, Blue, Fire Red, Leaf Green, it doesn't really matter. In this game, it takes you about 17 minutes just to get the Pokedex, your first Pokeballs, and your town map. I didn't catch my first non-starter Pokemon until about 20 minutes into the game, and I didn't fight Brock until over an hour into the game. Now, don't get me wrong, I know Final Fantasy VII has its fair share of slow points, but at the very least, the game waits until you've had your fun and blown up a power plant reactor before it slows things down for the first time and makes you listen to some of the game's story. And anyway, after this cutscene is over, the game rewards you by allowing you to explore your first town, and then after this, you get to fucking blow up another reactor. Now, meanwhile, in Pokemon, without even grinding or going out of my way to try and level up anyone on my team but my Charmander, it took me almost an hour and a half just to unlock the run button in the game. Now, before anybody says anything, I know that you can speed these games up if you play them on an emulator. But the difference is, when you're playing a game on Visual Boy Advance or No-Cache GBA or whatever, and you use the speed up function, it turns the music and the sound effects into this horrific alien mush that was never meant to be taken in by human ears. Now, the fact that people are willing to totally sacrifice their ability to listen to the soundtrack in these games just to fix how slow they normally are is a sign that they've got some pretty serious pacing issues, or at the very least that they're not as well paced as Final Fantasy VII here. While we're on the subject of music, is there even a video game with music that's better than this one's? Yeah, no, I don't think so. Now, in all seriousness, while this may not end up being your favorite video game soundtrack ever, I'd be really surprised if you didn't at least like it a lot. The music in this game is just really, really good. Definitely some S-tier stuff all throughout the game. There isn't a single bad piece of music in the whole entire fucking thing, which is definitely impressive because, as I'm sure you know by now, Final Fantasy VII isn't a short game. Like most RPGs, you're in for the long haul if you commit yourself to playing this thing, and it's not just long, right? It's not just a bunch of filler fluff until you get to the final boss and beat the game. It's chock full of content and offers the player a ton of stuff to do and explore. There are so many events and NPCs sprinkled throughout the many locations you can visit in this game that really help to make the world feel like it's living and breathing, like it exists separate from the game and the player's interactions with it. Like within your first hour of playing the game, you'll come across these two guys at the train station who just go through with a suicide pact together. They drink poison and die right in front of you. As I'm sure you can tell from this, the game has a lot of personality, and there's a bunch of weird, wacky, and usually pretty funny stuff spread throughout it. So even if you're not super invested in the main plot, I imagine you'll still get a kick out of at least a couple of the things you run into while playing the game. To be fair, plenty of other classic JRPGs, even other Final Fantasy games, do this as well, but where I feel Final Fantasy VII stands tall above many of its contemporaries is its combat. If you like turn-based combat, then you're probably gonna like the combat in this game. Like, I don't know what to tell you, but somehow they made a game where grinding is fun, and I think this can be attributed in large part to the materia system. Now, without going into too much detail, materia are these items that you can find in shops and scattered around the world that you can equip to your characters for pretty much any purpose you could think of. They add a lot of depth to combat and also make micromanaging and planning a whole lot more fun than they otherwise would be. If I had to give the game a score, and it wasn't already obvious,